Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the U.S. Naval Institute and AFC International, welcome to Day 3 of East Joint Warfighting 2013. Before we begin this morning's program, I'd like to make a few administrative announcements. As a reminder, questions during this keynote session and some of the panels will be taken electronically. You can email or text your questions to askme, JWC, @gmail.com. It is on the screen as well. Numerous conference sessions qualify for continuing education units. Please consult the conference website or your show guide for more information on these CEUs. To receive CEU credit, you must have your badge scanned by a conference staff who will be located in the back of each session area. The U.S. Naval Institute will be hosting book signings throughout today at their exhibit booth, number 1219, center aisle in the exhibit floor. Make sure to stop by their booth for a schedule and to take advantage of this great opportunity. AFC International will be offering a special one-year military government membership rate of $15 to any military government personnel who sign up for membership on site at the event. Please stop by the AFCEA booth, number 819, to take advantage of this special offer as well. Now, at this time, please join me in welcoming to the stage Vice Admiral Pete Daly, U.S. Navy retired, Chief Executive Officer, United States Naval Institute.
Good morning. Welcome to Day 3. We've heard a lot over the past few days about the current and future challenges, and it's important to remember that just 7 years ago, the U.S. had to confront the facts and the true nature of the conflict in Iraq. It wasn't pretty. The potential for total failure hung in the air. It was palpable. Our next speaker, author of Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, Counterinsurgency Lessons from Malaya and Vietnam, was the key participant in a writing team that produced the United States Army/Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Manual. How do his experiences in coming to grips with the true nature of the conflict and rediscovering the lessons of counterinsurgency inform us today? A graduate of West Point, he served as an armor officer in the United States Army for 20 years. He led a tank platoon in Operation Desert Storm and served as the operations officer of a tank battalion task force in Operation Iraqi Freedom, earning Combat Action Badge and a Bronze Star. A Rhodes Scholar and prolific writer, his work has appeared in Proceedings, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, Parameters, Joint Force Quarterly, and many others. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. John A. Nagl, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army retired, the non-resident Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security and Minerva Research Fellow, U.S. Naval Academy. Let's give John a great welcome.
Thanks, Admiral, for that kind introduction. It was 7 years ago and I think 2 months that I first became acquainted with AFCEA, U.S. Naval Institute conferences, when I was invited to go out to AFCEA West to talk about the newly published Counterinsurgency Field Manual. And what I'm going to do today is think about what we've learned in those 7 years since in a talk I call Counterinsurgency Revisited. My military life began in Operation Desert Storm, a war which was heavily influenced by the perceived lessons of Vietnam. Fight with overwhelming force, win the military conflict decisively, then withdraw rapidly, regardless of the mess you leave behind. Desert Storm was the war the Pentagon had wanted to fight ever since Vietnam, a war against a conventional enemy on a battlefield all but devoid of civilians, without jungles, mountains, or cities in which our enemies could hide from America's overwhelming firepower. Desert Storm was an enormous success on the surface, as tanks and air power changed the Iraqi army from the fourth largest in the world to the second largest in Iraq in a period of just over 100 hours. Satisfying as it seemed at the time, however, Desert Storm was a military triumph without political victory. Saddam Hussein remained in power to threaten his neighbors, a low-level air war continued for a decade, and ultimately we chose again to fight Saddam Hussein to topple him from power, adding another decade of war with Iraq to the historical ledger. The costs of that second Iraq war are staggering. Nearly 4,500 Americans killed and more than 30,000 wounded, many of them grievously, tens of thousands of innocent Iraqis wounded or killed, more than $2 trillion in direct government expenditures, with the possibility of another $2 trillion in indirect costs over the generations to come. And perhaps most immediately significantly as we think about the world we're in today, the significant weakening of the major regional counterweight to Iran and the consequent strengthening of that country's position and ambitions. Great powers rarely make national decisions that explode so totally and so completely in their face as the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the nation and the world will pay a heavy price for our hubris and our arrogance for many decades to come. The first Iraq war was necessary. This one was not. Iraq was not, as we were repeatedly told, developing weapons of mass destruction. Even if it had been, there was no reason deterrence, which prevented war with a nuclear-armed Soviet Union, could not have worked against a nuclear Iraq. There was no link between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, and no al-Qaeda presence in Iraq until the American invasion, ironically, which caused social order to collapse and provided the terrorist group with a powerful recruiting message and a dangerous new base from which to attack Americans. The invasion of Iraq and its bitter aftermath should remind politicians for generations of the high cost and unpredictable results for those who roll what Otto von Bismarck called the iron dice, and should forever discredit the notion of preventive war. Reluctance to send American ground troops to intervene in Libya and Syria provides some hope that the country will think more than twice before fighting another unnecessary war. Good intentions do not always result in favorable outcomes. In Vietnam, the U.S. military was slow to recognize and adapt to the demands of the counterinsurgency campaign it confronted. Over time, it improved its performance under the command of General Creighton Abrams, who took command too late, after the American people had already given up hope for that war. But the lessons learned too late recur again and again in the pages of counterinsurgency campaigns from the Philippines to the Malayan emergency. They include the importance of building capable local forces, linking political and military lines of effort, conducting effective information operations, protecting the population rather than focusing exclusively on killing insurgents, holding the terrain you've cleared rather than allowing the insurgents to reoccupy it. These old lessons were codified in the Marine Corps' Small Wars Manual of 1940, but they had to be relearned again and again in American military history. They were forgotten in the wake of Vietnam, and in fact, after that war, we intentionally turned away from the counterinsurgency lessons we'd paid such a high price learning, certain that we would never again fight that kind of war. We instead decided to focus on a kind of war we knew well how to fight, conventional tank wars against another tank army. I think the American military should be very proud of its renaissance after the debacle of Vietnam and subsequent triumph in the Cold War, and many of you in the room were a part of those triumphs. It was an enormous success. But our historical amnesia about counterinsurgency left us grievously unprepared for the wars of this century. British military historian Sir Michael Howard has noted that it's impossible to perfectly prepare military forces for the next war. What you can expect is not to get it so far wrong that the military cannot adapt to the specific demands of the war it faces when it is next needed. I would have to say that the Department of Defense failed that test in Iraq and Afghanistan. It ignored preparations for counterinsurgency operations and was completely unprepared for the demands of occupying Iraq after the invasion caused its government to collapse and Saddam Hussein to disappear into hiding. American actions, including the disbanding of the Iraqi army and excessive use of force early in the occupation, contributed to the raging insurgency that threatened to pull Iraq down into civil war, as Pete mentioned, when the counterinsurgency manual was published in late 2006 was very much the case. But we learned. President Bush was awakened by the repudiation that the American people gave him in the midterm elections of 2006. Both the House and the Senate switched from Republican to Democratic control. If America had a parliamentary government system like most civilized countries, the administration would have fallen. Instead, the president made the bravest decision of his presidency, deciding to double down on Iraq under the leadership of Secretary of Defense Bob Gates and General David Petraeus. Petraeus, who had written his doctoral dissertation on Vietnam and had prepared his whole career in case America needed him to conduct an irregular warfare campaign, applied the lessons of Vietnam to the Iraq fight. The U.S. Army, which had too long neglected the need for a deep understanding of languages and cultures, changed its spots in a remarkable example of organizational adaptation under extreme pressure. Winston Churchill said that you can always count on the United States to do the right thing once it has exhausted every possible alternative. By Petraeus' selection to command in Iraq, it had. And as history would suggest, the principles of counterinsurgency worked, although at great cost and in the nick of time, as the American public's patience with the war was about to expire. American support to the Sunni awakening proved crucial in rebalancing the forces on the ground that eventually changed the course of the Iraq conflict, and Petraeus received well-justified accolades for turning around a war that had seemed destined to be America's second consecutive loss in the irregular warfare category. He later had the chance to try it again in Afghanistan, which had been starved of the resources history demonstrates are required to succeed in counterinsurgency by the overwhelming demands of the debacle in Iraq. Counterinsurgency worked where it was resourced, particularly in southern Afghanistan, although slowly and at a very high cost. And the Marines, I think in particular, paid a very high price for what they succeeded in doing in Helmand Province. The question is not then whether the classic counterinsurgency principles of clear, hold, build work. The Marines showed that they do. The question is whether the extraordinary investment of time, blood, and treasure required to make them work is worth it. The answer to that question depends on the value of long-term stability in the country afflicted by an insurgency, and so that answer varies by time and place. Vietnam was not, as the Kennedy and Johnson administrations argued, an attempt to expand communism across all of Southeast Asia. Instead, it was largely a nationalist expression of anti-colonialism and a desire for independence, and that should have sounded familiar to Americans who were themselves products of such an insurgency a scant 2 centuries prior. Ho Chi Minh, quoting from the Declaration of Independence, should have been something of a wake-up call for us and indicated that we might even have been backing the wrong side. But the Democratic administration, who had absorbed the blame for losing China to communism under Harry Truman, were not about to let another domino fall on their watch. Ironically, when South Vietnam did ultimately fall to North Vietnamese tanks, it was the party in power on Capitol Hill who refused to uphold American obligations in the Paris Accords that we would come to the aid of our allies, a shameful episode in our history. But the fall of Vietnam, despite its horrible repercussions, did not signal the triumph of global communism, and ironically, it was a similar counterinsurgency campaign in Afghanistan that ultimately exhausted the Soviet Union. Stability in Afghanistan was not as essential to Soviet security as the Politburo had believed it to be, but the costs of the war in blood and treasure were crippling. Afghanistan fell to American-supported mujahideen when the Soviet Union could no longer pay the bills to support Afghan security forces some 3 years after the last Soviet soldier had crossed the Termez Bridge, in a lesson that should resound as we contemplate the future of our own efforts in Afghanistan 25 years later. Unlike Vietnam for us or Afghanistan for the Soviet Union, stability in Iraq was a vital national interest for the United States. Iraq's impact on the global oil market and position in the heart of the Muslim world meant that once having invaded, America could not simply withdraw her troops and hope for the best. We had not just moral reasons, but hard national interest that demanded a degree of stability in Iraq that appeared unachievable in 2006, but was clearly visible in the streets when I visited in the summer of 2008. It was hard to comprehend the change. The curbstones that had been shattered by bombs were already rebuilt and painted jaunty colors. The guardrails we'd ripped out with tanks after an IED planted behind one killed 2 of my soldiers were being reinstalled. Iraq mattered a lot, and although the invasion was unnecessary and the subsequent occupation largely unsuccessful, building some degree of stability there was worth the high cost. Afghanistan is a somewhat different case. My friend Steve Biddle at the Council on Foreign Relations testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that continuing to invest in stability in Afghanistan after the toppling of the Taliban and the scattering of al-Qaeda was a close call on the merits. An unstable Afghanistan would not disturb the global oil markets, and the neighborhood was not as susceptible to the contagion of Sunni-Shia conflict as Iraq's had been. Pakistan played a significant and profoundly unhelpful role in destabilizing Afghanistan by harboring and supporting the Taliban insurgents who regularly crossed the Durand Line, and by hosting the Quetta Shura of Taliban leadership. There was, and there still is, a danger that absent American support, Afghanistan could again be conquered by the Taliban and provide a new home for terrorists, including ones who might further destabilize nuclear-armed Pakistan. In my eyes, that danger was worth making an investment in counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, but the case was never as clear as it had been when we decided to surge forces into Iraq in 2007. And today, the end game remains unclear. Will Afghanistan end like Vietnam, an abject helicopters flying out of Kabul, people hanging on the skids kind of defeat, or in an unsatisfying and untidy sort of victory like Iraq? While neither option seems particularly attractive, the President and the country, I think, would welcome an Iraq-like end to Afghanistan. America can live with the current Iraqi government and its policies, and Iraq's increasing oil output will help the global economic recovery. This is an unsatisfying return on the blood and treasure we poured into Iraq, but it is not a complete loss, and it's far better than we could have imagined in 2007 when I was talking about the new counterinsurgency manual. At AFCEA West, Iraq had just descended into civil war, and al-Qaeda had established an important foothold there. It's not unlikely, I believe, that 2015 will see a similarly reasonable Afghan government that will hold together with American money and advisors. An unsatisfying end, but not a failure, and not without the promise of greater stability to come. Like any successful counterinsurgency campaign, Afghanistan is likely to end somewhat unsatisfyingly for Americans, with a corrupt but gradually improving government in Kabul, advisors helping Afghan security forces fight a weakening but still dangerous Taliban, and a schizophrenic Pakistan alternately helping Afghan and Taliban fighters. A reasonable outcome in both wars, unsatisfying as it seems, is about the best we can hope for in what is likely to remain an age of unsatisfying wars. There is every chance that America will fight another counterinsurgency campaign in a generation, or perhaps much sooner. This is true despite and perhaps even because of the Defense Department's strategic guidance released at the Pentagon on January 5, 2012. Standing with Secretary of Defense Panetta, who had replaced Gates at the Pentagon the previous year, President Obama held a press conference at the Pentagon, the first one in history, emphasizing the importance of the moment. The document, titled Sustaining U.S. Global Leadership, Priorities for 21st Century Defense, explicitly ordered the end of long-term nation building with large military footprints. That goal is laudable, but it ignores the reality that the United States is currently involved in a number of counterinsurgency campaigns, fighting insurgents in Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Philippines, and the Horn of Africa, and supporting insurgents in Syria, after having recently helped other insurgents topple the government of Libya. Recognizing that post-invasion stability operations, including counterinsurgency, are core military tasks for which the Pentagon must prepare, is an important first step. It would also be wise to make further investments in remotely piloted vehicles, special operations forces, and the capacity to train and advise foreign militaries. All of these, I think, will bear much more of the burden of the most likely conflicts of this century. Of course, given the spending constraints now being imposed by Congress and the subsequent painful trade-offs those constraints bring, It remains to be seen whether those lessons have been fully learned. Insurgency against governments has existed as long as men have governed others. The United States was herself born in the crucible of an insurgency. The final tragedy of Iraq and Afghanistan would occur if we again forgot the many lessons we have learned over the past decade of war and had to learn them yet again in some future war at the cost of many more American lives. I'm a product of a Jesuit education, and St. Augustine taught us that the purpose of war is to build a better peace. But we have not built the capacity to create that better peace in the American national security establishment. The historical record reveals that the United States engages in ambiguous counterinsurgency and nation-building missions far more often than it faces full-scale war. Similar demands will only increase in a globalized world where local problems increasingly do not stay local, and where, as Secretary Gates noted, the most likely catastrophic threats to our homeland are more likely to emanate from failing states than from aggressor states. Trends such as the youth bulge and urbanization in underdeveloped states, as well as the proliferation of ever more lethal weaponry into more hands and the radicalization of individuals and small groups over the internet, point to a future dominated by chaotic local insecurity and conflict rather than confrontations between the armies and navies of nation states. This future of persistent low-intensity conflict around the globe suggests that American interests are at risk not from enemies who are too strong, which was the case throughout the 20th century, but from states that are too weak to control what happens inside their borders, with Pakistan as the most obvious and most dangerous example. As a result, the U.S. military is more likely to be called upon to counter insurgencies, intervene in civil strife and humanitarian crises, rebuild nations, and wage unconventional types of warfare than it is to fight mirror-image armed forces. We will not have the luxury of opting out of these missions because they do not conform to preferred American ways of war. Both state and non-state enemies will seek more asymmetric ways to challenge the United States and its allies. America's conventional military superiority, which remains substantial, will drive many of them to the same conclusion. When they fight America conventionally, they lose horribly in days or weeks. When they fight unconventionally, by employing guerrilla tactics, terrorism, and information operations, they have a better chance of success. It is unclear why even a powerful enemy would want to risk a costly head-to-head battlefield decision with the United States. As Secretary Gates has said, our enemies and potential adversaries, including nation states, have gone to school on us. They saw what America's technology and firepower did to Saddam's army in 1991 and again in 2003, and they've seen what IEDs are doing to the American military today. The developing strategic environment will find state and non-state adversaries devising innovative strategies to counter American military power by exploiting widely available technology and weapons and integrating tactics from across the spectrum of conflict. The resulting fights will be protracted and will hinge on the affected population's perceptions of truth and legitimacy rather than the outcome purely of tactical engagements on the battlefield. This is the kind of war we are struggling to understand in Afghanistan. It's the kind of war we are most likely to face in the future, and the learning curve is not going to get any easier. Counterinsurgency campaigns are messy and slow. I thought I understood that idea when I read those words, the words of T.E. Lawrence in Oxford in 1996. But having the personal experience of fighting in a bitter counterinsurgency campaign in Iraq myself underlined just how grinding and exhausting they can be. The classical principles of counterinsurgency do work, but success in these wars is unsatisfying at best, and even then comes at a price higher than many would consider acceptable. The final calculation depends on how important the national security objectives at stake are to the nation. If they are vital, essential to the protection of the homeland or our interests, then counterinsurgency may continue to be the least bad option available, and remembering the hard-earned lessons of counterinsurgency is a worthwhile insurance policy, like all insurance policies, one that we hope we will not have to call upon again. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been long, hard, and slow. but there is at least one silver lining among the clouds for the American people. In the wake of Vietnam, the United States began its grand experiment of an all-volunteer military, and it was most certainly an experiment. There was no expectation that the system would hold together in a major war, and for 2 generations, young men have been required to register with the Selective Service in case general conflict erupted. But there have been 2 such wars in the past decade, and the All-Volunteer Force has come through these crucibles of blood and fire with enormous distinction. We often remember the greatest generation of World War II, which was tempered by the Great Depression and then helped defeat fascism on 2 continents, saving civilization. But as loudly as their contributions resound in history, 2/3 of those who fought in that war were drafted. This new greatest generation has fought longer, if not harder, than its grandparents did, and all have been volunteers. My own tank task force lost 22 fine young men during the Second Iraq War, including a West Point captain and 5 lieutenants, and earned well over 100 Purple Hearts. The nation owes these young men and women a depth of gratitude it can never fully repay. But it can begin by ensuring that we pay for those who have borne the battle and for their spouses and their orphans, to paraphrase America's greatest wartime president, Abraham Lincoln. The traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder that are the signature wounds of these wars are invisible and hard to heal. As many as 1/4 of those who fought in Iraq will suffer the ravages of these injuries for decades to come. This is not a compelling list of gains when balanced against the unbearable losses America has endured in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it would devalue the sacrifices of the many who have suffered if we were not to read these lessons written in blood, if our politicians did not approach future interventions with greater humility, if our military did not prepare for all possible wars rather than only the ones it wants to fight. We can and we must hope that from such peril and toil, this great young generation, some of whom are here in this room today, tempered by war and hardened by what its members have seen and done, will build a better future for a wiser and chastened America that may yet, we hope, learn from our mistakes. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And Terry, I believe, is going to provide questions from the mouth of God.
Yes, sir. First question, how can we balance and retain our hard-earned conventional warfighting skills that have atrophied over a decade of war?
That's a great question. So we certainly were not ready for the kind of wars that we fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. We did adapt and learn. Unlike in Vietnam, we learned fast enough to keep the American people with us. It was a near-run thing. But as a result of those wars, the ground forces of the United States in particular have forgotten, have not been able to practice some of the conventional at the lower end, which I think we're going to be called upon to do repeatedly. But we have to regain our skills in conventional warfare, state-on-state warfare, not least to shape the decisions that China makes as it emerges to great power status in the Pacific. And we're going to have to do all of that. We're going to have to walk and chew gum while facing a declining, I believe, share of the nation's resources to do that. And so that's going to take an awful lot of hard trade-offs. I'm concerned that there's a risk that as we return to regaining our conventional skills, some of the softer skills, the political understanding, the cultural understanding. I'm a Minerva professor at the Naval Academy, a program started by Secretary Gates to try to increase the understanding of cultures and languages and other societies at all of our professional military education institutions. I'm afraid that we're going to let some of that go away. And it's going to take inspired leadership and hard resource trade-off decisions to maintain those capabilities while finding smarter, cheaper ways to regain our conventional skill set. Really, really a hard problem, and a continuing problem, I think, for at least the next decade. It's not going to go away.
Next question. We as a nation respect religious freedom and are uncomfortable with the association of religion with terrorism, yet violent Muslim extremism and Sharia are what they are. Do we have our head in the sand, and are we confronting that reality?
That's really hard. Really, really hard. So the vast majority of Muslims follow the teachings of the Quran, which prohibit murder, require people to take care of the weak and the innocent, and there are some few Muslims who do not, as there are some Christians who do not follow the tenets of their religion, which requires the same thing. All peoples of the book really have the same rule set, but don't necessarily follow it. What we have not done, I think, is invested in understanding the Islamic world to nearly the extent that we should have. So after Sputnik, there was a huge pouring of national resources into science and technology that bore fruit in the space program. After September 11th, I believe there should have been a similar pouring of resources into understanding the Islamic world, learning the languages, the cultures, the societies, and we have not put commensurate resources there. We also have not built an information operations capability commensurate with the information operation demands of the 21st century. So I'm a fan of the Tofflers, Heidi and Alvin Toffler, who believe that there have been only 3 revolutions in all of human history: the agricultural, the industrial, and the information. The agricultural revolution took thousands of years, the industrial revolution took hundreds of years, and the information revolution tens of years. And the rate of change is faster than it has ever been in human society. But we have not, as a nation, built the capability to influence people, to change people's minds as effectively as we should have. And I think that is the glaring error, first of the counterinsurgency manual that I helped to write. It wasn't that we didn't recognize the problem, but we couldn't in an Army Marine Corps book promulgate information operations doctrine for the United States of America. Unfortunately, nobody else has picked up that ball and run with it. And so that is both, I think, the biggest failing of the counterinsurgency manual and of the American national security apparatus in the wake of the attacks of September 11th. And we're still not devoting the resources to it that we should.
Thank you. Next question. Following Quran burnings, Arab Spring, and Benghazi, the Marine Corps is being proactive, getting squads and battalions to sites before crises, with close coordination with SOCOM and the State Department. In your view, is this on the right track?
So what we're seeing throughout the Arab Spring is the collision of the information revolution with traditional societies, governed in many cases by tyrants, by dictators, some of whom we have supported. We supported during the Cold War. In some cases, we continued to support them for years afterwards. That revolution as it becomes increasingly hard for governments to control the information their people receive, as individuals and groups become better able to mobilize themselves and put pressure on underperforming governments, evil, corrupt governments like the one in Syria. That is going to continue to happen. That, I think, is the story, the big story of the 20 years following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the communism is on the ash heap of history, and I think now information-empowered populations are turning against other kinds of tyranny and will continue to do so. So in that world, America is going to have interests at risk, and we're going to need more rapidly deployable military forces, stationed forward in more places, with more capable, younger, junior leaders leading those small teams. And so I think the Marines are doing the right thing, not just by stationing crisis response units forward, and this is, of course, pains me as an old Army guy to say this is, of course, what the Navy and the Marines are for, and it's what they do so well. I think there's going to be more demand for that. We didn't have those resources in the right places on September 11th of last year in Benghazi, when Benghazi happened, and we're going to try hard to have forces in the right places as this turmoil continues. We're not always going to be able to be everywhere, but this kind of requirement has huge implications for what our force structure should look like, what kind of ships we should be building, how we should be training our small units. And one of the, let me say another nice thing about the Marines. I'm going to get my Army card revoked here. The Marines have also started a program where every Marine is assigned a language and a region of the world when they enter the Marine Corps. And they receive bonus pay for proficiency in languages that they are encouraged to develop on their own. That, I think, is a remarkably wise investment. It's the kind of thinking that I think we need to do as the world continues to get more complicated, as conflict continues to emerge, which is gonna just keep happening.
Next question. Yesterday, the TRADOC commander, General Cohn, emphasized the Army determination to keep the links forged between special operators and the Army's big units. What do you recommend?
This is one of the good news stories that I didn't mention, probably should have, of the last decade of war. Our special forces and our conventional forces have become much more closely integrated. Our conventional forces, in many cases, have learned skill sets and been required to do missions that were formerly the exclusive province of special operations forces. Tank battalions like mine were doing high-value target capture-kill operations repeatedly over and over again. Even tankers can be taught to do these things. So there's some good news there. And we've also dramatically increased the size of our special operations forces, and we're trying to continue to do so. Those are all not just lessons learned that we need to preserve, but capabilities we've developed that we need to maintain. And if you haven't read Stan McChrystal's book, My Share of the Task, he does a wonderful job of talking through what he was able to do, particularly good on what he was able to do in Iraq, speeding up the capabilities, making the observe, orient, decide, and act, the OODA loop, more effective. So he went from, it took 3 days to plan an operation, execute it, exploit the information gained, and then 3 days later you could do another operation, to multiple operations in the same night, with the ability to exploit resources found on target and turn another hit, sometimes 2 more hits in the same night as you continue to walk the ladder. We've got to hold on to that capability. I'm confident that the Special Operations Command will retain that capability. We also have to put more of it into our conventional forces and increase their agility, their speed of decision making, their ability to anticipate and exploit intelligence. And those are more hard tasks, but in an era of constrained, declining resources, there's some of the places where I think investments can be made, and it's places where technology can actually help the warfighter a great deal. So my hope is that some of you in the room are working on some of those capabilities.
Next question. Other than Navy special operations, what is the Navy's role in counterinsurgency?
So that depends widely, the Navy's role in counterinsurgency depends widely on the terrain, where the insurgency is happening. If it's a country with a seacoast, with rivers, then control of the seas, control of the rivers is enormously powerful. And the lessons learned during the riverine operations that Admiral Zumwalt created while he was the 3-star in charge of riverine ops in Vietnam are still worthy of study. There's a lot of lessons learned there. The air power contributions over Vietnam from the Navy were, of course, enormously significant. One of the more interesting ones and less discussed probably and of more immediate relevance to much of this audience has been the Navy's electronic warfare skill set, which was hugely important as the Army, in particular the Marines, found themselves fighting in an electromagnetic spectrum that they didn't know how to operate in, as wireless systems became used to detonate improvised explosive devices. And the Navy and its EW technicians and some of its electronic warfare capabilities were called on by the ground forces, and we deployed a bunch of sailors, radar techs, EW specialists into Iraq to give us that capability. That lesson, I think, is another one that I should have captured that we need to hold on to. The electromagnetic spectrum is going to continue to be a place where warfare is conducted. Arguably, cyber attacks can be seen as a form of insurgency, certainly a form of irregular warfare, often conducted by individuals, small groups, non-state actors, and these are areas where the Navy has a whole lot of capability that can be enormously helpful.
Next question. What eating soup with a knife lessons are important to the young military leader in post-Iraq and Afghanistan? Do you feel that we have informed that leader on the path ahead?
I am, as I said in my remarks, enormously proud of this generation of young people. I joined the military in 1984 during the Reagan defense buildup, and Vietnam was a full decade in the country's past, and although the Soviet Union was real and was there and was present and horribly oppressed Eastern Europe in particular, that there was not a particular danger of war when I joined. This generation of young people, the ones who signed up after September 11th, who volunteered for service knowing that they were going to war, who have endured multiple combat tours. We now have the most experienced, combat-experienced ground forces the country has ever had since the Revolutionary War, right, with the number of combat tours these young people have had, the leadership experiences they've had. They've served as mayors of towns. They've conducted political negotiations. They've engaged in economic development as well as all of the warfighting skills. Phenomenal group of young people. I'm enormously concerned that we're not going to hold on to that talent. That as we inevitably draw down in the wake of these wars, as the military gets smaller, they are not going to be as interested in spending time in the motor pool of Fort Hood, keeping the tanks functioning, important work, but not nearly as exciting as what the nation called on them to do at a very young age in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So we've got to find a way to push power down, to maintain their enthusiasm, to educate them, continue to educate them. And the panel I was privileged to sit on yesterday, the innovation panel, Dave Perkins, Lieutenant General Dave Perkins of the Army's Command and General Staff College, Combined Arms Center, General Perkins talked about the Army pushing more people into graduate school, giving them broader experiences, because in the world we talked about, small units working with State Department, working with CIA, working with USAID around the globe, we're going to need a very different, much broader type of military officer who has the technological capability, the leadership skill set, the ability to use and employ weapons systems, but also has a much broader cultural and political knowledge base. We are, I think, moving in the right direction, but I'm very concerned. A friend of mine, Tim Kaine, wrote a book called Bleeding Talent, about the talent that the military loses every year. Many of them go into businesses that are important to the security of the nation, and I admire that and I applaud that, but we've got to figure out a way to hold on to some of this extraordinary talent that has had literally irreplaceable combat experience and keep them engaged in the security of the nation. But I can't say enough good things about this generation of young people. They are phenomenal.
Next question. In your estimation, do you think that we will inevitably be drawn into action in Syria?
So we of course, already are engaged in Syria, although not with conventional military forces. I think it is I am hopeful that we can find another way to put pressure on Assad. I am heartbroken by the fact that we don't have a relatively small force, a stay-behind force in Iraq right now, exerting influence on Iraq. I am not pleased about the trajectory of events in Iraq, but I am also very, very disappointed and saddened by the fact that Iraqi airspace is being used by the Iranians to transmit weapons and support to Assad in Syria. So I firmly believe that if we had an American stay-behind force in Iraq, that Assad would already have fallen. If he didn't have Iranian support, if the Iranians were not able to easily provide almost unlimited support to Assad, I think he would already be gone. And so as we think about ways to put pressure on Assad, one of them is to get the Iraqis, the Iraqi government that we played such a huge role, paid such a huge cost to help build, have them put pressure on Assad, stop allowing the Iranians to reinforce Assad. So my hope is that there are diplomatic ways to do this. I am as concerned as I am about the humanitarian carnage in Syria, the tyrannic despoilation of that country, destruction of that country that is currently happening at the hands of its own government. I am even more concerned by what happens afterwards. And I think we're starting to understand that even operations as apparently successful as the one in Libya, the hard part isn't toppling the government. It's building a better peace afterwards in what remains. And we have not developed much of a capability to do that. We have not made much of an effort in Libya to shape events after the fall of Gaddafi. After Assad, then what, is the question that I think we should really be thinking about and figuring out how to influence that. That takes more State Department resources. It takes more resources for the Central Intelligence Agency, and the sequester and the lack of resources to the executive branch, international relations, national security agencies makes all that harder. And just like deferring maintenance on an aircraft or deferring maintenance on a ship, deferring maintenance of those capabilities and of those relationships in places like Syria just means it's going to cost more later. So I think as a nation, we are being penny wise and pound foolish in preparing for the aftermath of Assad. That was cheery. Sorry about that.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. First one, many claim our counterinsurgency doctrine is not applicable to all situations, is too focused on Iraq, and has not worked in Afghanistan. Is our COIN doctrine not being applied correctly, or is Afghanistan too austere and unstable for our version of COIN?
Great question. The counterinsurgency manual was written with an eye toward Iraq and Afghanistan, inevitably written largely over the course of calendar year 2006 as Iraq was actually spiraling down. And so there's no doubt that Iraq and my Iraq experience, General Petraeus' Iraq experience heavily influenced what we wrote. That said, it draws upon and relies upon classic principles of counterinsurgency that go back at least to the American experience in the Philippines at the turn of the last century, if not even further back. And so the book, I think, is standing up pretty well. We've struggled in Afghanistan for a number of reasons. Most important of those is Pakistan, the continued support of Pakistan for the insurgencies inside Afghanistan is enormously unhelpful, and we have not figured out a way to change those threat perceptions inside Pakistan. There's some indications that we may see some movement there, and of course we need to congratulate Pakistan on the first successful civilian-to-civilian transfer of power ever in that country's short, relatively brief history. But Pakistan makes Afghanistan very hard. The other thing that makes Afghanistan so hard is that it was starved of resources for so many years. So we did not start taking Afghanistan seriously, I would argue, until 2009, and didn't really push the resources into Afghanistan that were required until 2010, and we're withdrawing them already by the summer of 11. So Afghanistan is a case in which American national interests were not as significantly affected as was Iraq, as they were in Iraq, and where we did not resource the fight to the same extent. That said, where we resourced counterinsurgency, it worked. It just took a long time and was really expensive. And the best evidence I can offer in support of that is a new book by a friend of mine, a good friend, a very brave man, Carter Malkasian, who's worked on behalf of the State Department, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think he's got 4 years under his belt, coming up for 5. He is currently General Dunford's cultural advisor in Afghanistan. Carter's book, War Comes to Garmsur, which references back to a book about Vietnam, War Comes to Long On. War Comes to Garmsur tells the story of Carter's work in Helmand Province and demonstrates that counterinsurgency does work. It takes committed people who learn languages, understand the culture, even more important, understand the power relationships inside the society. But it's messy and slow, and it's enormously, enormously expensive. Last question, Terry?
Yes. Seeing the continuous threat of the Taliban, is it realistic or possible to have a full withdrawal of troops?
So we expect, I think John Kerry, Secretary of State Kerry, said earlier this week that we can expect a presidential announcement soon, sort of this month soon, on what the stay-behind force will look like in Afghanistan. I think one of the lessons of Iraq, where we haven't had that stay-behind force, and as I mentioned, where the lack of that force has contributed to the destabilization of the entire region, I think that lesson, I hope, has been learned, and I think we are likely to leave behind a force in the high single-digit thousands, 8,000, 9,000, perhaps as many as 10,000 forces. Jim Mattis, Marine General Mattis recommended a force of 13,000. I would prefer that number, but my sense is that you can do a lot of good with something approaching 10,000. Those Americans, and as important as the skills that they will bring as special forces operators, continuing to conduct counterterrorism operations, as intelligence gatherers, intelligence analysts, advisors to Afghan security forces and to Afghan ministries, as important as all of those talents and resources are, the air power that they'll be able to call in, the medical evacuation that they'll be able to provide, just as important will be the fact that 10,000 or so Americans in Afghanistan mean that the U.S. Congress will continue to write the checks to support the Afghan security forces. So Afghanistan didn't fall to the Taliban when the Soviet troops left. It fell 3 years later when the Soviets stopped sending checks to pay the bills for the Afghan security forces. American troops on the ground in Afghanistan mean that Congress will continue to spend the $4 billion, $5 billion a year that it will cost to keep the Afghan security forces standing and continuing to fight against the Taliban. In my eyes, that investment is a very, very wise one. We don't want to have to go back and take over Afghanistan yet again. And so my hope is that we're going to maintain that investment and reap some small return for the extraordinary investment in blood and treasure we've made over the last decade.
Let's give John a big hand. I'd like to remind our audience I was struck by the terrific dialogue here, questions and answers, and remind you that you can continue discussion and come by the Naval Institute booth where John will be signing copies of his book, and invite you to come by and continue that discussion. I want to thank John for his wonderful remarks, which really get to the heart of a lot of tough questions that we have to ask ourselves before we can move